On November 1969, Native Americans took over Alcatraz Island, referencing to an 1868 treaty between the federal government and the Sioux, saying that any unused federal land belonged to the Native Americans.
The Native Americans occupied the land for 19 months. They felt a responsibility to their ancestors and future generations to find a place for the Native Americans to go to explore their culture. However, in June 1971, federal marshals kicked the remaining Native Americans off of their land. The Native Americans' rights were violated when they were kicked off of the island.
Throughout history, Native Americans have not been treated fairly. They were not given their rightful land during the Dakota War. Many of their rights have been violated over time, and they have been ignored in society.
In 1868, the federal government made a treaty with the Sioux. The treaty was meant to bring peace between the American Indians and the federal government, and to stop wars with the Indians. The treaty said that any unused or abandoned federal land belonged to the Native Americans.
In 1964, the first occupation on Alcatraz Island took place. The occupation lasted only 4 hours, and most people thought of it as a stunt that didn't mean anything. Even though it did not seem like a historic event, it was taken to federal court, but the judge's final decision was to have the Native Americans return the land to the people of San Francisco.
On November 20th, 1969, a group of about 80 Native Americans boated to Alcatraz Island. These 80 tribal people called themselves Indians of all tribes. They protested the United States government's ongoing economic, social, and political hatred towards American Indians.
The 80 Native Americans were mostly made up of college students from suburban homes. Some of these people were Native American activists. The tribal people wrote a sign that said, "Warning, keep off, Indian property." Richard Oakes, a Native American activist, said the proclamation.
We, the Native Americans, reclaim this land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth.
The American Indians wanted the island to be a place for all tribal people to come for spiritual building. They had a plan to establish their culture. The Indians immediately began to talk about building a cultural center and educational complex. Eventually, a university, cultural center, and Native American museum was added to Alcatraz Island.
Every day, the women would prepare breakfast and dinner for everyone on the island. The children would run and play together in the old exercise yard. Lookouts would stand out and look for government officials coming to the island. Life was not easy on Alcatraz.
Water and electricity supplies were cut off to the island by the government. During the early months, food and supplies were gathered on the mainland of San Francisco. However, the government had about 100 people to interfere with the delivery boats coming to the island.
During the occupation, Native American activists visited Alcatraz Island. They planned to take over many government-owned buildings. This is one of the things that started the Red Power movement.
On January 3rd, 1970, a 13-year-old girl named Yvonne Oakes fell to her death. It was a 3-story fall inside the warden's house. Yvonne Oakes was Richard Oakes' stepdaughter. After his stepdaughter died, Richard Oakes left Alcatraz Island. Richard Oakes was an important person for the island government, so after he left, the government on the island did not work as well.
On the evening of June 1st, 1970, there was a very big fire. It started accidentally by the occupants. The fire spread, and it ended up destroying several important parts of the island.
Support from the public became less and less. Then, on June 11, 1971, 15 federal marshals came and kicked the remaining 15 Native Americans off of their rightful land. The Native Americans had been negotiating with the government, but not all of their needs had been met.
The government said that the Indians had been destroying buildings, stealing valuable copper, and not taking proper care of the island's lighthouse. The remaining Native Americans seized an abandoned night missile after they were taken off of the island before dawn on Tuesday.
This was done in the hills east of El Cerrito. which was a suburb of Richmond. After the occupation ended, federal marshals stood guard on Alcatraz because they didn't want any invasions on the island.
The takeover of Alcatraz was very successful, and it changed the way that people viewed American Indians. It also brought their rights to attention with the federal government.
After the occupation ended, there was a movement called the Alcatraz Red Power Movement, or the ARPM. The ARPM was different than past protests or movements by the Native Americans. This movement was much more serious and much more violent than others.
The first protest was on Thanksgiving Day, 1970. There were a few organizations that protested on the Trail of Broken Treaties. Native Americans took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. From 1970 to 1971, Congress passed 52 legislative proposals on behalf of the Indians.
American Indian Movement members painted Plymouth Rock red. There were double the funds for Native American health care, and scholarship funds for college students increased by $848,000.
The longest walk was the last major event left over from the occupation. The walk took place from February to July 1978. Hundreds of Native Americans walked from San Francisco to Washington, D.C.
Unlike most of the events after the occupation, this walk was very peaceful. The Nixon administration promised that they would respond to the American Indians' demands within a month because they were embarrassed by the media coverage, and gave them $66,000 in transportation money in order to end the occupation peacefully.
Great progress has been made with how the Native Americans are treated in society. They have many more rights, and many people now see historic American Indian events, like the Dakota War, from the Native Americans' perspective. Many people now understand how American Indians have not been treated fairly.
While big steps have been made in Native American rights, they still don't have as many rights as they should have. We take many rights for granted every day that the American Indians and many other people don't have. Many Native Americans still aren't respected as they should be.
Brought Native peoples together in a way, in an intertribal way that we had not really been before. As I said a while ago, you had regional and sort of statewide and tribal specific events of activism. But Alcatraz was one of the first, if not the first, moments where you had multiple tribes.
While there have been many other occupations over time, Alcatraz was one of the first important ones. The occupation of Alcatraz was a very peaceful and non-violent event. The occupation was also very different than other occupations.
And so that was a galvanizing and a sort of a turning point. And it signaled to both Native peoples a moment of a real pride, a sense of we are somebody and we deserve to be heard. We deserve respect, which we haven't really had a whole lot of prior to now.
One of the reasons is that Alcatraz was one of the first occupations where not just one tribe but many tribes came together. When the tribes came together, they didn't just occupy the land with each other, but American Indians also formed friendships. This was a way to come together.
Although there are still many rights that Native Americans should have, the occupation of Alcatraz was a very big historical event for American Indian rights. Because of the occupation, Native Americans have been given many more rights. The occupation got much of the public to see that the occupiers should have the same amount of rights as anybody else.
The American Indians who occupied Alcatraz Island brought hope to their future generations of Native Americans. The occupiers had hopes that they would have equal rights in the future, even if it wouldn't be fair then. Although a substantial amount of Native Americans' rights have been looked over and over and over again, the American Indians still have hopes that they will be treated equally in the future. The occupation of Alcatraz was a major change to the Native Americans, American Indian rights, and how people view the Native Americans.